Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Alexander Rosenthal again, the founder and co-founder and director of the Petrarch Institute. I'm here with Dr. Miles Smit. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. If you tuned in for the first time last week for our podcast on rhetoric, I am the disembodied voice that you heard intermittently. I'm very pleased with some hopefulness to be with you both in my visible and audible form this week. Alex, if people are tuning in for the first time or haven't seen all the podcasts, did you want to tell them a little bit about course offerings that we have coming up?
Yeah, so I mean, basically, for those who don't know, the Patriarch Institute is an online learning center promoting classical learning, and our next course will be offered in October. It's called Classical Philosophy and the Virtues, and what we're really trying to do is bring the highest and most excellent things in the Western civilizational tradition to a very broad audience at affordable prices. So that is largely our objective. So what are we talking about today, Miles?
For today, Alex, you had a really good idea, which was to talk about the impact and benefits of classical education over time, but also in different areas of human endeavor. And I was really struck when you suggested that it's a good idea for a discussion for a wider audience. We have a tendency, I think, to think of things that are distant in time as being a bit like things that are distant in space. I mean, you say that they vanish to a dot in terms of their knowability or their impact, but it is pretty clear when you start to look at it that people who've exhibited particular excellence in a lot of areas of human endeavor in disciplines like arts and letters, in the sciences, and in politics, for those people, the figures like Cicero, the pillars of classical education loomed close and were really living presences for them. Would you agree with that characterization?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think one of the most interesting things is the fact that in turning to the classics, one is both looking back and looking forward at the same time, because it has seemed as though when you look at the backgrounds of some of the highest achievements that we value in the categories you mentioned, in art and science and in politics, we find the presence of the classics. So looking toward the ancients has furnished the fuel for future progress and development in all these areas, down into the 20th century, and developments in science and things that you wouldn't immediately expect. And that is, I think, when one of the most common critiques of the classics is, are they useful? I think that merely looking at the historical record will show that not only are they useful, but they're really, the way I put it, the gift that keeps on giving, right? The periods, ages, and persons who have turned to the classics have often been the people who are the most creative in moving the ball forward. So that's what I find very interesting about it.
What about that first area, arts and letters? There are figures from the modern era, Renaissance, that are known names today. Can you give us some examples of those who were deeply informed by what they found in the Greco-Roman sources, for example?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think first of all, to really do a thorough job would take us all day, because the number of figures that have been influenced by the classics are too large, to speak about the influence of the classics in the arts and letters is a gigantic theme in itself. But let's just take one household name, Michelangelo, right? So Michelangelo was, I mean, first of all, he was obviously born in Caprese near Florence, the very heart of the Italian Renaissance, where Greek and Roman classics were being recovered. His tutor, Francesco de Urbino, was a humanist, so he received a humanist education, but perhaps even more significantly for Michelangelo's development was in the year 1490. He gets invited to Lorenzo de Medici's court, and he joins the Florentine Academy. Now, what is the Florentine Academy? It was basically a group of the most illustrious classical scholars in Italy. Figures like Marsilius Ficino, who's the founder, and Pico della Mirandola, Polizzano, right? These figures would meet in gardens and have discussions on classical themes and philosophy. This was also where the translation of Plato was being done, right? So you have, just as you had the Aristotelian translations that I referenced in earlier videos going on in the High Middle Ages, Plato was being translated into Latin, being made accessible. So there was a huge Platonic movement going on, which becomes important, very important for Michelangelo's development. So he was there for 2 years, from 1490 to 1492, and then on the death of Lorenzo, then he gets his commission in Bologna and he starts his work. But I think if you're looking at Michelangelo's work, well, there's three things. One are actual classical themes in his art, right, which are legion, right, whether you're talking about the Cupid or the Sibylline oracles or that stuff. Then is the style and form of art, even the basic forms like the freestanding nude sculpture, right, was basically a revival of the classical forms, as was a basic theme in the Renaissance, right? If you think of Brunelleschi's dome and all these things, they were going back to the classics to recover these artistic techniques and as a font of artistic creativity. But what I think is most interesting are the conceptual elements of classicism that come through, that scholars write about in terms of his poetry, the influence of Neoplatonism. And especially you have one single idea which I think is very powerful, is the idea that invisible and eternal beauty is reflected in the visible things, right? And of course these were Christian Platonists, so they thought of, right, the divine beauty, right? In some way the divine beauty is manifested or reflected in the physical forms and the physical beauties, and so that it's actually a way to move from the sensible to the spiritual or the intelligible, right? And this was something which deeply inspired this sort of Christian Neoplatonism was something which deeply inspired Michelangelo's work. Should I look maybe at some of the literary figures as well, perhaps?
I think people would be interested in hearing about that. Yeah, especially you've mentioned in the past Cervantes and Shakespeare as two of the reference points that are very noteworthy.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think with Cervantes and with Shakespeare, you have the two most widely, the figures that are the most discussed and are sort of considered as the pinnacles of the two most widely spoken Western languages today, right? English and Spanish. So maybe start with, I'll just mention a little something about Cervantes. You know, obviously he's considered sort of in some ways the founder of modern literature, right, with Don Quixote being thought of as the prose novel. The dominance of the prose novel sort of begins there. And what's interesting, I think, by the way, about both Shakespeare and Cervantes is that neither one came from an extremely privileged background, right? Although Cervantes had some nobility in his past, he was the son of a barber surgeon, and they were often struggling financially, right? But he, as a young man, it's generally believed that he received an education from a tutor by the name of Juan López de Hoyos, who was a follower of Erasmus, right? And Erasmus was, of course, the big northern humanist at the time, and he was called by the Hoyos his beloved pupil or his beloved disciple, and so forth. And he received a classical education there. From there, he led kind of a swashbuckling life, right? He went off to Italy to make his fortune as a soldier, and what he probably thought of as his proudest moment that he talked a lot about. He fought at the Battle of Lepanto, and although he was sick below deck, he came up out of the deck and was wounded in his battle. He lost the use of his left hand. On the way back to Spain, he was waylaid by pirates, and was enslaved for some 5 years in Algeria until he was ransomed by members of the Trinitarian order. And then he finally, I guess it was in his mid-30s or so, he finally comes back to Spain and begins his settled life as a writer. And if you look at what critics and scholars have said, many of them are impressed by the number of classical references, right? So you can think of just the fact that Don Quixote is referencing Horace and Virgil and these sorts of things. But also people see in the epic form of Virgil, the wandering hero, many classical allusions in the text itself, and also in his poetry works like Voyage to Parnassus, which is kind of a satirical, poetic work. But Parnassus was, for the Greeks, where Apollo and the Muses were said to dwell. So it's about the poem is a sort of a satire about the pretensions to greatness of various poets, and there's a lot of classical allusions in it. So I think that probably covers some of the themes that you see in Cervantes. Should I talk a little bit about Shakespeare?
I think that's a great touchstone, because that's somebody that willy-nilly everybody knows, if only from high school or Shakespeare in the Park.
Yeah, so about the same time that Cervantes would have been either fighting or in or in captivity, Shakespeare would have been a young boy at King Edward VI Latin school in Stratford-on-Avon, right? And it's it's generally believed that this is where he got all of his classical information that you see throughout his plays. Well, you could think of just the fact that drama, tragedy, and comedy are classical forms, right? But, I mean, what he would have learned there would be your basic cycle of what they think is that especially Roman drama, Plautus and Terence and all these sorts of figures, as well as just Roman literature, Virgil and stuff, that people are not really sure how much Greek was going on there. But that was very central. They may have even, according to some sources, performed plays, and that the students would have had to speak Latin all the time. And then if you look at how this manifests in his plays, right, not only in terms of the forms he was using, having classical origins, but look at the amount of classical plots, right, classical settings. Julius Caesar, Troilus and Cressida, which is set in the Homeric world, Timon of Athens, Coriolanus, Titus Andronicus, Antony and Cleopatra. Roman history is a constant, Greek and Roman history is a constant reference point for his plays. And then you could look also at the structure of the rhetoric. I mean, I talked last time about, Mark Antony's speech in Julius Caesar, right? Students of rhetoric say that, that it used a lot of actual classical rhetorical motifs in there, right? I think it's in the Merry Wives of Windsor. There are even discussions of Latin grammar and these sorts of things, right? So there is a deep immersion in the classics throughout the works of Shakespeare, to the point that I don't know how someone fully understands Shakespeare's works if they have no acquaintance with the classics.
For the audience, some of that will not be surprising. It'll be enlightening and interesting, but they can easily see that poetic forms grounded in the letters of the ancients could live on and be immediate for people in the early modern era, like Shakespeare, in a similar way that Shakespeare, once you understand his use of English, is very much alive and enlivening for us. But people might be more surprised to learn about the relevance of science, because there's a sense that the science of someone like Aristotle is a dead letter. You've written elsewhere that you can see the relevance of a classical education in the science, not just of the early modern scientific revolution, but for figures like Bohr and Heisenberg as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was something that was kind of interesting to me. I mean, there was recently an article I was reading by a fellow named E. Christian Kopf that drew my attention to just the degree to which the recovery of the classics impacted the sciences. And as you say, that might be a little bit more, even though we could say that the Greek spirit of rational inquiry sort of inaugurated the Western scientific tradition, clearly we believe there are a lot more elements than the 4 that the Greeks talked about, the 4 or 5 that the Greeks talked about. Right? Clearly, the factual elements of modern science have moved very far from where the Greeks are. So why is it that you find, wherever you find great scientists virtually, you find this keen interest in the classics, right? So you have Copernicus, who is really reviving the ancient theory of Aristarchus, right? You have Isaac Newton, who writes his Principia in Latin, and is constantly the references to Euclid, and also, as Kopp points out, to Gassendi's revival of Epicureanism and the theory of the atoms, right, which has played a very large role. And what's even more impressive to me is that when you look at the 20th century, the number of leading physicists, Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, Max Planck, all of these, luminaries of the, late 19th and 20th century physics. So many of them were deeply immersed in the classics. Werner Heisenberg, in fact, his father was a classical philologist, right? And he talks in interviews of how much time he spent looking at Plato's Timaeus and this sort of thing. And I thought maybe it might be interesting for me to just talk for a moment about speculate why is it that the classics have been so fruitful even in natural science, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think there's 3 things. There was an interesting story I read about. So around 1870, Germany, which in the 19th century was a huge center of both the classics and many areas of culture in general in the 19th century, for the first time opened the universities, for example, the scientific faculties, to people who had no background in Greek and Latin studies. 10 years later, the faculty wrote to, I believe it was the German government, protesting, right? So Germany had split up. You had the classical schools and what they called the Realschulen, the technical schools, and you would expect the people that go to fact-based technical education that might be more focused on the sciences would tend to do better. But what these professors said is, yes, for the first 6 months, those that went to the technical schools did better. But after that, it was those who went through the gymnasia, the classical schools, that did better. And basically their argument was the training in mind and creativity and the ability to grasp and manipulate and use concepts creatively, which the classics seem to achieve, are achieved by nothing else, right? So that the person who's able to grasp and understand and creatively generate even ideas because of their training of mind that the classics give, over time proves to be better than a fact-based education, right? And you think about the fact that facts are constantly changing as well, right? Even our scientific models today are not what they were in the 19th century. So I think that that's one thing, the training of a mind. And the other thing is, as I mentioned, there's sort of a stock of ideas that the classics provided. If you think about things like the atomic theory, right? Even notions of evolution, right? Think about Aristarchus and his heliocentric theory, right? I mean, there was just sort of an idea machine going on in antiquity that was trying to conceive of virtually every possibility and every permutation, and that provided a huge stock of ideas from which modern physicists could draw from when they're thinking, well, what is actually going on here? You see what I mean? So I think that, and the third thing maybe is what Werner Heisenberg, I believe, mentioned, which was the fact that the mathematical orientation of the Greeks led him to look beyond the purely physical aspects of the universe, right? So mathematics and rationality and these elements, which are so important for modern science, was very much part of the Greek perspective, and the deep absorption in that perspective he thought was an asset to him.
Yeah. Some people may know that in the world of Greek science, as it was, and Greek medicine, there was, a perennial struggle between empirically oriented and rationally oriented thinkers, and in some ways those columns march on today, and there's a kind of creative strife between them, I think it's safe to say.
Absolutely. But I mean, another thing that kind of interests me is the way in which fields that you might not think interlock very deeply end up interlocking, right? I mean, one thing that I notice about the Greeks reading them is how often medicine and medical metaphors come in philosophy. You know what I mean? Like the whole notion of the mean in Aristotle, he's constantly using metaphors drawn from health and medicine and these sorts of things. And now that I've read a little bit on Greek medicine, I actually feel I have a better insight into many of the things that are said in Plato and Aristotle. So it's just kind of interesting the way sometimes our very strict disciplinary separations don't serve us in some ways, the specialization of them.
Well, as our segue into politics, we're coming up on the centenary of World War I. As you said earlier in this podcast, we could probably discuss this topic easily all day and have more left over in baskets at the end. But you could do a podcast just about the late Habsburg Empire and the wealth of minds that were produced under what was at that time a precarious civilization, but one which had tremendous educational assets. In terms of politics, I think we agreed that the American founding is an extraordinary example of a case where the figures from Greek and Roman republics are known by the founders almost face to face through history and letters, as it were.
Absolutely. This is something which I think is extraordinary. And I think when we're now going from the world of Europe to the world of America, which is in a sense, to use a Latin phrase, terra nova, right? It's sort of a new world where you can think about starting again, right? Look back at history. You're trying to create a new republic, one which will, a new form of government, one which will endure. And what greater asset can there be than to look back at history and see the experiments which have worked and which have not worked? And especially in terms of classical, well, the classical inspiration of America is very obvious. First of all, it's a republic. It has a Senate. The Congress meets on Capitol Hill, right? The classical illusions in American politics, as well as just the visual impression of neoclassical architecture everywhere are extremely compelling, let's say. Maybe one figure to talk about would be John Adams, who was a very, very deep admirer of Cicero. I think he said at one point that there was never a figure in all the annals of history in terms of combining philosophy and statesmanship like Cicero. He said to carry Cicero around with him all the time. His No Angles, which was his polemic against the Tories, the domestic Tories in 1775, is sometimes said to have been modeled on the Catiline orations of Cicero and this sort of thing. But I think that the most important idea in Adams, in his prolific writings on government, his defense of the American constitutions, discourses on Davila, etc., is this idea of mixed government, which he derives from Cicero and Polybius. What's the basic idea? Well, what Cicero and Polybius argue is, why is the Roman constitution to be admired? It's because it is not a simple form of government like a democracy, an aristocracy, or a monarchy, but rather it combines all three elements, right? The monarchy in the power of the magistrates, the aristocracy in the Senate, and the democracy in the citizens' assemblies, right? And each of these balance each other, right? So, first of all, the very idea of looking back to the Roman Republic and reviving this political form as a modern form, right, suggests deep classism, but also this basic idea of the separation of powers and checks and balances, which are so central to the American system of government, derive in large part from discussions of the Roman Constitution and mixed government, especially since they were moving away from the standard European form of a throne and altar, Christian monarchy, which was the standard form in the 1770s, certainly, right? They were trying to look at, what kind of new system of government can we create. But the classics also play a major role in the debates about what America should be like between, for example, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So is that worth a glide into for a moment?
Much so.
Yeah. So maybe start with the Federalists because they are so well known. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, but talking mainly about Madison and Hamilton. In this case, well, first of all, they signed their name Publius after Publius Agricola Publicola, was one of the founders of the Roman Republic, right? So they take the persona of the founders of the old Roman Republic. Now, then let's look at what are the Federalists basically arguing for? They want, so you have the Articles of Confederation, where the states are virtually sovereign, though they meet in Congress. And what they're arguing for is a stronger executive and a stronger federal government, right? So in Federalist 34, they talk about events in Greek history to an incredible level of detail. They're talking about the Amphyctyonic League, which was the League of Greek city-states. And why did it fail? They argue, well, it failed to produce unity, right? Because there was no strong executive, no overarching power, and therefore they were easily taken over in the end by the Macedonians and later the Romans, right? So they're using, and they try to argue that the danger of anarchy resulting from the internecine wars which Greece often experienced is at least as great as a danger as the danger of tyranny, right? And then in Federalist 70, Hamilton talks about the problems that the Romans had in dividing the executive power into two councils, right? Because the Romans were so afraid of kings, they didn't want to have one executive, right? So they divided into two, which could each veto each other. As a result of which, Hamilton felt Rome fell into constitutional crises. And then in Federalist 34, they talk about the Roman system of the bicameral legislature, right? The Comitia Tributa and the Comitia Centuriata, right? One being more patrician, one being more plebeian, right? And that was basically, of course, the system that was devised, right? The Senate balancing the House of Representatives, right? So in the case the Federalists make, the reference points of Greek and Roman history are absolutely central. But the same is true of the anti-Federalists. So, for example, Robert Yates, who takes the name Brutus. Now, who is Brutus? Well, the Bruti in Rome were both those who kicked out the last king, Tarquinius Superbus of Rome, and the descendant of the original Brutus was the one who assassinated Julius Caesar because he claimed to make himself king. Right, and I believe in the play Julius Caesar, right, Cassius is appealing to Brutus's ancestry, right? Your family honor depends on you ending tyrannies, right? So what the anti-federalists are talking about is the danger of tyranny from an overarching executive or from the power of the federal government over and against the states. And in Brutus 1, they also, arguments from Roman history are also made, Greco-Roman history, in terms of how they fell into tyrannies, and also the fact that the areas which were being governed when they were not tyrannies were much smaller than what the federal government was proposing to govern. And I guess the last point would be just, I've mentioned about Adams. He got into a very heated argument with a fellow by the name of Benjamin Rush, who argued that everything Greek other than the New Testament should just be burned. So you can imagine this set Adams off, and he spent a lot of time talking about the greatness of the classics in law and language and politics and everything else, right? How central and important they were. So I think what's interesting there in that little debate is, right, people could think, well, America is making a new beginning. Why don't we turn our backs on the past and just look forward, right? But this was quite the opposite of what the founders, and I hope what I tried to sketch out there, were actually doing. So.
Yeah, very much so, Alex. I mean, I think that's three generously sized appetizers talking about how either revolutions or deep innovations in arts and letters or science or politics were born in great part out of retrieving the fertility of classical contributors of great note, and how going backwards to those well-grounded sources allowed people to achieve extraordinary levels of excellence in human achievement. If people want to learn more about this sort of thing, what do we have on offer that could fill that appetite?
Right. Well, right. So again, our website is www.patriarchinstitute.com, and I would strongly encourage people just to write me at alex@petrarch-institute.com. You know, if you have any interest in learning more about our courses, because I mean, the same things which have created these achievements in the past and developed all these great figures of history are in effect still alive and can do that again in the future, right? As long as we keep it going. So that's what it's about.
Very much so, and the conversation also goes on Twitter now. You can find us at Petrarch Center, CENTRE, on Twitter, and in any of those channels, we look forward very much to hearing from you.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Miles, and thank you all for joining us, and I hope to hear from you.
Yes, indeed, and we'll see all of you next time.
Take care.